You are standing in a room full of people. Laughter echoes, conversations flow, yet a strange emptiness gnaws at you from within. Surrounded by bodies, you feel unseen. This is not about the number of people around you, it is about the absence of connection with yourself. Loneliness in a crowd is the silent testimony of a mind that has lost touch with its own essence. True loneliness is not something that comes from being physically alone. You can be surrounded by hundreds of people, yet feel a vast emptiness inside. This emptiness arises when you are disconnected from yourself, when your own thoughts and feelings become strangers to you. The mind constantly searches for validation and approval from others, trying to fill a void that can only be understood by turning inward. Seeking fulfillment outside creates a sense of isolation. Because no external presence can ever replace the intimacy, you must cultivate it with your own being. Many people mistake social activity for emotional connection. They attend gatherings, laugh at jokes, and nod along in conversations, but their hearts remain untouched. When interactions are only superficial, the mind becomes restless and the sense of loneliness deepens. Comparing oneself to others intensifies this feeling because the mind is trapped in measuring, judging and aspiring rather than simply being present. In that constant measuring, the warmth of shared humanity slips away, leaving only a hollow echo in crowded spaces. Emotional dependence on relationships or situations only strengthens the prison of loneliness. When every joy is sought externally, every disappointment becomes magnified, and the mind remains in a state of subtle panic. People fear being alone because they have not learned to enjoy the company of their own consciousness. This fear drives them to fill every moment with activity and chatter. But crowds cannot replace the depth of self-awareness. The more you run from your own presence, the louder the silence of your inner world becomes. Awareness is the key that opens the door to true companionship. Deep listening to your own thoughts, observing without judgment, and embracing your emotions creates a connection that no external environment can provide. When you face yourself without distraction, the feeling of emptiness begins to dissolve. Happiness is not something gifted by others, it is discovered within. True intimacy arises when you are comfortable in your own skin, and only then can relationships with others become real, not a desperate attempt to escape solitude. Loneliness is a signal, not a punishment. It shows the distance between who you are and who you have forgotten yourself to be. By cultivating inner alignment, by truly inhabiting your own consciousness, you turn rooms full of people into spaces of presence rather than emptiness. When you learn to be fully with yourself, the world shifts. The crowd no longer overwhelms, comparisons no longer define you, and the quiet within becomes the source of all connection and fulfillment. Many people confuse social activity with emotional fulfillment, believing that being around people, laughing at jokes, or attending gatherings can fill the emptiness inside. They fill their schedules with noise and distractions, thinking that the presence of others can substitute for the absence of self-awareness. But no external activity, no matter how engaging, can touch the depth of the void within. True fulfillment arises not from crowds or conversation, but from understanding and embracing one's own mind and heart. Until you are willing to turn inward, all social interaction remains superficial. Like a fleeting shadow that disappears the moment attention shifts elsewhere. The mind's constant search for approval and validation from others further deepens this sense of emptiness. When your sense of worth depends on applause, recognition or comparison, every interaction becomes a test you cannot pass. You begin to observe yourself through the eyes of others rather than your own, and in that process, your inner world becomes a stranger. Loneliness grows not because people are absent, but because your attention is pulled outward, leaving no space for your own presence. The more you seek to fill yourself with external affirmation, the more hollow the inner silence becomes. Comparison and judgment are silent killers of connection. When you measure yourself against others, every room, no matter how crowded, becomes a stage for inadequacy. You see laughter and companionship, yet cannot partake in it fully because your mind is entangled in envy, insecurity, or self-criticism. Superficial conversations cannot heal this separation, they only accentuate it. Until you recognize that the world's reflections are not your reality, you remain isolated, surrounded by life, but untouched by it. Dependency on external relationships or situations intensifies the sense of solitude. People fear being alone because they have not learned to enjoy their own company. They rely on others to provide comfort, happiness or meaning. And when those sources are unavailable, the mind panics. Crowds become a temporary refuge, a way to escape the confrontation with oneself, but they never provide lasting connection. The inner world demands attention, and neglecting it leads to persistent loneliness, even in the midst of people. The path out of this emptiness begins with awareness and presence. Listening to your own thoughts, observing your emotions without judgment, and cultivating a relationship with your own consciousness transforms the perception of loneliness. Happiness emerges from within, not from applause or acknowledgement. When you are at home in your own mind and heart, every room becomes alive, every connection authentic, and the inner void is replaced by presence. Crowds no longer overwhelm, external noise no longer distracts, and the emptiness that once defined you gives way to profound connection with yourself. When the mind constantly seeks approval or validation from others, it loses touch with its own rhythm and essence. Every thought and action becomes a performance measured against imagined standards and expectations. You start observing yourself through the lens of others, and in doing so, your own reality slips away. Life is no longer experienced directly, it is filtered through the judgments and reactions of those around you. In this state, even in a room full of people, a deep sense of emptiness arises because the mind is busy seeking affirmation rather than simply being present. This relentless craving for acceptance conditions your every interaction. Conversations are no longer exchanges of energy or understanding but tests of worthiness. You laugh when you do not feel like laughing, nod when your heart disagrees, and mold yourself into shapes that please the eyes of others. The more you invest in this pursuit of approval, the further you drift from your inner self and the more loneliness grows silently but unmistakably. Your own presence becomes unfamiliar, and even familiar faces fail to awaken a sense of belonging. Dependence on external validation traps you in cycles of hope and disappointment. A kind word can uplift temporarily, and a glance of disapproval can crush you completely. Your emotional state becomes a hostage to the fluctuating moods of others, leaving little room for inner stability or freedom. The mind loses its sovereignty, and in its absence, a hollow space emerges, untouched by the presence of others. Crowds can no longer console you because the emptiness is internal, not external. True connection, then, is not found in the recognition of others but in awareness of oneself. Observing thoughts, embracing feelings without judgment, and accepting your own being creates a foundation that validation cannot provide. When the mind no longer depends on external approval, it experiences freedom, presence and clarity. Loneliness begins to dissolve naturally because you are no longer looking outside for what exists only within. Crowded rooms no longer feel alien because the inner companion is awake and attentive. Approval seeking is a veil that blinds you to your own life. The more you try to please, the less you live and the emptiness within expands silently. By releasing this need, you reclaim your attention, your energy and your essence. Life starts to flow through you authentically, and the presence of others becomes a shared resonance rather than a measure of your worth. Loneliness is replaced by self-possession, and in that state, even the busiest room becomes a space of grounded awareness and profound presence. The habit of comparing yourself with others creates a subtle but powerful barrier that cuts you off from the present moment. Every glance at someone else's success, appearance or charm becomes a measure against your own worth. And in that measuring, the mind forgets its own ground. Even in a room filled with warmth and laughter, comparison makes you feel distant, as if you are an outsider observing life instead of living it. The mind shifts its attention outward, constantly evaluating, calculating and judging, leaving no space for true connection with yourself or with others. Comparison breeds restlessness and dissatisfaction. Because it always positions you in lack rather than presence, you begin to believe that your own experience is insufficient, that your joy, your accomplishments and your being are incomplete. Every moment becomes a reminder of what others have that you do not, and the noise of these thoughts drowns out the quiet awareness of your own life. Crowds, which could have been a source of shared energy, turn into mirrors reflecting imagined inadequacies, amplifying the feeling of separation. This inner measuring alienates you from both the people around you and your own consciousness. You laugh, nod and participate, but your heart is elsewhere, trapped in the mind's endless comparisons. The shared space is no longer a space of presence. It becomes a theater for self-criticism and longing. You remain physically present yet emotionally and mentally absent, and that absence is experienced as loneliness. Even those who care for you cannot bridge this gap because the barrier exists within your own perception. Comparison also fuels dependency on external validation because your worth feels determined by the reflection of yourself in others. Compliments, attention and recognition temporarily soothe the mind, but they cannot provide lasting fulfillment. The inner void persists, growing quietly as you chase shadows of approval. True liberation from this pattern requires a turning inward, a conscious recognition of your own value and a refusal to measure it against anyone else. When the mind stops comparing, it finally finds room to breathe, to exist fully in the present and to experience connection without judgment or expectation. The crowded room ceases to feel oppressive because your attention is no longer scattered outward but centered within. You begin to witness life not as a series of benchmarks, but as a living reality that flows through your own presence. In that stillness, the invisible walls of comparison dissolve and loneliness is replaced by the fullness of being. When you rely on others to provide your sense of happiness or security, you hand over the keys to your own inner freedom. Every smile, every word, every gesture from another becomes a test of your worth, and when the expected response does not come, a deep emptiness opens within. Your mind becomes a prisoner, endlessly anticipating approval, fearing rejection, and measuring every interaction against imagined standards. In this state, even when surrounded by people, you remain isolated because the center of your attention is never within yourself. Emotional dependency creates subtle chains that bind your consciousness to the moods, actions and reactions of others. Your joy is no longer your own, it is borrowed, conditional and fleeting. When people fail to meet your expectations, frustration, disappointment and loneliness rise like a tide inside you. The more you rely on external sources for emotional fulfillment, the further you drift from your own being and the louder the silent void of inner isolation becomes. The mind becomes trapped in cycles of hope and despair, constantly oscillating between desire and disappointment. You enter rooms full of people seeking validation, yet no amount of attention or acknowledgement can fill the gap inside. Crowds cannot replace the companionship of your own consciousness, and laughter around you feels hollow if your own presence is absent. Emotional dependency blinds you to the truth that fulfillment cannot come from outside, it is born only when you reclaim your attention and energy for yourself. Breaking free from this pattern requires a radical shift in awareness. When you begin to observe your own emotions without judgment, when you recognize that happiness and peace exist first within you, the chains begin to loosen. You stop looking outward for satisfaction and start cultivating the inner landscape that alone can sustain genuine connection. Presence becomes your refuge, and the emptiness that once haunted crowded rooms begins to recede. The release from emotional dependency transforms every interaction into a conscious choice rather than a necessity. You no longer chase approval and no longer fear disconnection because you are complete in your own presence. Relationships and social spaces cease to dictate your emotional state, and inner loneliness gives way to self-possession. When the mind stops depending on external sources, even the busiest, noisiest room can become a space of grounded awareness, peace, and authentic engagement. When the mind becomes still and begins to observe itself without distraction, a new dimension of presence emerges. Deep listening to your own thoughts is not a passive act, it is an active engagement with the self. Every thought, every subtle emotion, and every unspoken tension carries a message about who you are and what has been neglected. When you truly pay attention to these inner movements, you begin to see the patterns that keep you restless, anxious, or disconnected from yourself. Awareness of the present moment allows the mind to stop wandering endlessly into past regrets or future fears, and it anchors you in the only place where life truly unfolds here and now. The practice of self-awareness transforms loneliness into companionship. When you sit with your thoughts without judgment, the inner world stops being a foreign territory and becomes familiar, alive and expressive. You start to recognize the richness that exists inside you, a universe of emotions, insights, and creativity that has always been present but overlooked. The inner companion is not a concept but a living reality that speaks through silence, reflection and attention. In this awareness, the mind no longer feels abandoned, and even moments of solitude become nourishing rather than painful. This inner listening reveals how much energy is wasted on external distractions and unconscious habits. Many people fill their lives with noise, activity, and social engagement to avoid confronting themselves, yet the very act of turning inward exposes the sources of dissatisfaction and disconnection. As you observe your own mind, you see where dependency, comparison, and unfulfilled desires reside. Awareness allows you to disentangle from these patterns, to reclaim energy previously lost to distraction, and to cultivate a state of clarity and grounded presence that cannot be shaken by external circumstances. Through present moment awareness, you begin to inhabit your own being fully. Every thought and feeling becomes a point of learning and connection rather than a trigger for fear or avoidance. The mind grows stronger in its capacity to witness without judgment, and the heart becomes capable of understanding itself deeply. This self-connection creates a stability that crowds cannot disturb and solitude cannot threaten. The inner companion becomes a source of guidance, reassurance and presence that transcends the need for validation or approval from others. Ultimately, awareness of the present moment is the foundation of freedom from inner emptiness. It allows you to meet yourself authentically, to engage with your inner world without fear, and to transform loneliness into profound companionship. The mind no longer drifts in search of connection because it has discovered a constant, unwavering presence within. In this state, the external world, whether filled with people or quiet spaces, becomes secondary to the richness and completeness of being fully awake to oneself. Fear of facing yourself drives people to seek constant distraction in the presence of others, yet no amount of company can fill the emptiness that exists within. Crowds provide a temporary illusion of security, a way to escape the silence where the mind confronts its own unrest. People immerse themselves in chatter, laughter, and activity, hoping to drown out the subtle unease that arises when they are truly alone with their thoughts. But the moment the noise fades, the same emptiness returns, louder and more insistent, because it was never the absence of people that caused it. It was the absence of self-connection. Avoiding oneself through social distraction only deepens the divide between consciousness and experience. The mind becomes restless, constantly scanning the environment for stimuli, approval or recognition, while the heart remains unvisited. In the pursuit of external comfort, the inner world is neglected and the foundation of authentic presence is eroded. This fear of turning inward keeps life shallow, relationships superficial, and the feeling of belonging perpetually out of reach, even in rooms full of people. Crowds can never replace the depth of connection that exists within a conscious mind. Real intimacy begins not with another person, but with the act of being fully present with your own thoughts, emotions and sensations. When you avoid this, every relationship, conversation or gathering becomes a temporary patch over the deeper longing inside. You may be physically surrounded, yet emotionally and mentally absent, as the inner emptiness waits patiently for acknowledgement. The courage to face oneself requires willingness to sit with discomfort, to witness emotions without suppression and to observe thoughts without judgment. In this practice, the mind slowly shifts from seeking escape to cultivating awareness. The silence that once felt oppressive transforms into a space of clarity, self-knowledge and even joy. Crowds lose their power to distract or overwhelm because the attention is no longer scattered outward but anchored inward. Ultimately, the fear of facing oneself is the root of loneliness in any situation. When this fear is confronted, when the mind and heart are allowed to be fully present with themselves, the sense of emptiness diminishes. Crowded rooms cease to be a refuge or a source of anxiety because connection has been found in the one place it was always waiting, within your own consciousness. Presence becomes complete and the mind no longer seeks escape in the noise of others. Most social interactions remain superficial because they are driven by habit, expectation, or the desire to impress rather than genuine engagement. People talk, smile and nod, but rarely pause to connect deeply with themselves or with those around them. Conversation becomes a surface, level exchange of words, and emotions are often hidden beneath the masks of politeness or performance. In this environment, even warmth and laughter fail to penetrate because the heart has not been invited into the interaction. True connection requires presence, and without it, every social engagement remains a reflection of distance rather than intimacy. Being comfortable in your own presence is the foundation for authentic relationships. When you are at ease with yourself, your mind is not seeking approval and your emotions are not dependent on external validation. This self-comfort allows you to listen deeply, respond genuinely and participate in life fully without fear or pretense. The energy you carry becomes grounded and real, and it naturally invites others to step beyond superficiality. Comfort within oneself is not arrogance or isolation, It is a conscious alignment that makes every interaction meaningful and every connection possible. When the mind is restless or judgmental, it projects insecurity onto others, creating invisible walls that block intimacy. People become mirrors for your fears, expectations and comparisons, and interactions are filtered through these internal distortions. Superficiality arises not from the people around you, but from the mind that fails to engage with them directly. True presence dissolves these distortions, allowing you to see others clearly and connect without the interference of ego or habit. The depth of interaction grows naturally when the inner world is calm, attentive, and fully alive. The practice of being comfortable with yourself is an ongoing process of observation and acceptance. It requires noticing the patterns of thought and emotion without resistance, embracing them as part of your experience, and letting go of the need for constant distraction or approval. In this space, conversations transform from performance into dialogue, and social interactions become opportunities for genuine exchange rather than fleeting display. Being fully present in your own company creates a resonance that others can feel and respond to, deepening the quality of every connection. Ultimately, intimacy is born from self-possession rather than external proximity. A crowded room may remain shallow if the mind is restless, but the same room becomes vibrant and alive when you carry presence within yourself. Comfort in your own being allows the heart to engage openly, the mind to listen without judgment, and the soul to interact without fear. True connection begins inside, and from that foundation, every relationship, conversation and shared moment can carry depth, authenticity and meaning. Happiness that depends on others is fragile and fleeting because it is always subject to conditions beyond your control. When you tie your joy to someone's approval, attention or actions, you hand over the reins of your inner life to forces that are inherently unpredictable. Every smile, every word of recognition, every show of affection can lift the mind temporarily, but it cannot create lasting fulfillment. The moment the source of that external happiness shifts, disappears or fails to meet expectation, the mind feels abandoned and the emptiness returns, often stronger than before. True happiness is an inner cultivation, a skill of the mind and heart rather than a gift from the outside world. It arises when you learn to observe your thoughts and emotions without attachment, to nurture the quiet contentment that exists beneath the surface of constant desire and distraction. This happiness is not reactive, it does not fluctuate with the moods, opinions or actions of others. It becomes a stable presence that informs your experience of life, allowing you to engage with the world freely rather than in pursuit or avoidance of external validation. When happiness is cultivated internally, the mind no longer perceives isolation as a threat. Crowds, silence or solitude cease to determine your emotional state because fulfillment is anchored within. You no longer chase people, situations or approval in an attempt to feel complete, because the sense of completeness is already present. In this space, loneliness loses its grip, not because others are present, but because the inner companion, the conscious, aware mind, has been awakened and embraced. The process of cultivating internal happiness requires deliberate attention and willingness to face oneself. It demands observing desires, fears, and habitual reactions without judgment and slowly disentangling from the dependence on external circumstances for emotional well-being. With practice, the mind begins to stabilize, the heart opens, and the quiet contentment that has always been there becomes visible and tangible. This internal work shifts perception, so life is no longer a search for fulfillment outside, but an experience of presence, awareness and connection within. When happiness is fully internalized, every relationship, every encounter, and every social situation transforms. Interaction with others becomes a choice, a shared exchange, rather than a necessity for validation or joy. Crowds no longer amplify emptiness, conversations no longer feel hollow, and solitude no longer intimidates, because the foundation of happiness is rooted in the self. In this state, loneliness is no longer a shadow that follows you, it dissolves entirely into the presence of your own conscious being. Self-discovery begins with the courage to turn inward and face the unexamined parts of your own mind. It requires observing your thoughts, emotions, and habitual reactions without distraction or judgment, and recognizing the patterns that have shaped your sense of self. In this process, you begin to see how much of your energy has been spent seeking fulfillment outside, how much of your attention has been given to comparison, approval and expectation. Awareness of these patterns is the first step toward reclaiming your inner space and creating a life that is rooted in presence rather than reaction. Inner alignment grows from consistent attention to your own consciousness. When the mind and heart are attuned, they move in harmony, and a stability emerges that is not dependent on external circumstances. This alignment allows you to be fully present, to experience life directly rather than through the lens of judgment, fear or desire. In crowded rooms, you no longer drift in search of validation or connection because the center of your awareness is firmly established within yourself. Presence becomes your anchor, and the external world simply mirrors the calm and completeness you have cultivated.